Please be seated, my friends. Hey, got some fun teachings today, don't we? So, if you will, just grant me a little latitude this morning, all right? Just a little bit. Not asking for a mile, but we're going to go out and then we're going to come back. I want to tell you a story. This past week, Teresa Paxton and I had the honor of spending the evening with our next door neighbors. Pastor Pierre, his wife Jill, and their daughter Bonnie have lived next door to us on Regency for almost as long as we have lived in Bartlesville. And while we have been friendly, courteous, and neighborly, the most that we've seen each other is on Tuesdays, when we both go out to the street to get our garbage can and bring it back to the house. This year we decided that we should take the time to get to know each other better if we're going to be living next door to one another. And we decided that for starters, we should have dinner together. And we did. I know that some of you enjoy those kind of relationships in your own neighborhood, or you will soon, or that you have in the past. And as you might imagine, as the evening wore on, during the conversation, I would guess that each one of us looked at each other and thought, we should have done this sooner. And one of my favorite moments of the evening was when Pierre told us about how he had recently gotten his citizenship. And that among the laws of the land, the ones that he has found most challenging to navigate are not, in fact, those hallowed articles of the American Constitution. But, can you guess it? The laws, the compendium of laws associated with the Department of Transportation. Yes, traffic law. Pastor Pierre hails from Lebanon, and as you might expect, navigating an intersection in the Middle East is quite different than navigating, say, Silver Lake and 75. It's very different. And that upon reflection, Pierre was and remains amazed at how we as Americans trust in the laws that govern the rules of the road. For us, right, it's as simple as green means go and red means stop. But not for him. For in his native country, there are no stoplights. There are no patterns of right of way. People stop in the intersection to say, how are you doing? Right? There's no right of the road. And this experience has created in my neighbor an almost zealous cautiousness. And that has served him quite well over the years. And I will tell you that quite literally, Pierre is probably the safest driver in town. And as unexpected as this story might sound to you all this morning, I can't help but think about my friend's reflection on our living laws and Jesus's interpretation of the laws of his day. When I do, I think about how Pierre's life experiences have taught him to be a cautious person, despite what he may have encountered in teaching. He takes things with a grain of salt. And by doing so, it has expanded his ability to feel out situations differently than those of us who solely base our judgment on principle. Experience, I have learned, is shaped both by social and ethical ideals. As we left his house that evening, he was following us out. And as he was sort of shepherding us, as you might expect, like, go, 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 I noticed that he was speaking softly behind Teresa and I. And after a second, it occurred to me that he was blessing us as we were leaving his house. He was literally praying us out the door as he sent us on our way. And as we turned back, we saw this great big Lebanese smile. And Teresa and I realized that we had just met a righteous man. Jesus once said that unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. Righteousness, we know, just doesn't deal with the composition of our prayer lives, but it has to do with justice, morality, and mercy too. You might say that it has more to do with being in right relationship than it does with the soundness of any argument that seeks rightness over the relationship itself. I mean, just think about God's relationship with us, right? As followers of Jesus, we are to accomplish this surpassing righteousness, striving for what we do through reconciliation that is rooted in justice and immersed in God's grace. But we learn that this kind of righteousness, through Christ's own words, is impossible for those who are focused merely on their own standing before God, their own personal sense of merit in comparison to other people, right? Just remember that story of the publican and the Pharisee, right? I'm glad I'm not like this guy. Just remember that story. There is no way to achieve this righteousness as an individual in isolation from others. The very attempt to do so, to establish one's own self-righteousness, leads only to alienation, divisiveness, and as we see all in front of us all the time, violence. In a way, I think, knowing this, Jesus begins this portion of his sermon with the first of 6 teachings in which he takes up and interprets anew an old and accepted teaching based on the law of Moses. He is not replacing the older teaching when he does this with something that's new. Because right before this, he said that nothing will change from the law, right? It's not a replacement or abolishment of Moses' law, but rather a new interpretation. Jesus is interpreting the law anew and reclaiming, or through a process of realization, trying to focus on the original intent of Moses' law, which I think we could all believe was righteousness. And thus, whether the teaching that we encounter in the gospel has to do with anger, adultery, divorce, the sacredness of our oaths, the way we do or do not retaliate, and even in the love of our enemies, even in the way that we love our enemies, righteousness, when it comes to those relationships, doesn't necessarily have to deal so much with the letter of the law as it does with what is behind the law, what is generating that energy towards the other. And I believe that's grace. And so righteousness is at work when we love in relationship. Even those relationships can be changed over time, and they can be shaped in some very unpleasant and somewhat harmful ways throughout our life. We nonetheless learn something from the relationships that we have been in this life. And I think we are to honor those relationships. We are to honor that learning, honor the life that we've been given. The denial of that is ultimately the denial of God's grace at work, not just in ourselves, but in the other person too. It's a denial whether we like them or not, whether we believe them or not, whether we trust them or not. It ultimately chokes and denies the power of God's grace for both people. And so forgiveness and reconciliation and grace are to be known not just experiences of our own individual heart. It requires more than one person. It requires the other. And the experiences are to be communal. And through that recognition, right, these practices bear witness to God's transformation of the world around us. We are, in a sense, to be ministers of that grace. What I think it ultimately comes down to, when you stand before God, I think only two questions will really matter. And that was, how fully did we love? And how deeply did we learn to let go?